Don't let me do it again.
Hello, I'm Richard Bram, and I want to thank the Italian Street Photography Festival and my friends Alex Liverani, Stefano Mirabella, and Francesco Sembolini for giving me this chance to talk to you. I wish we could do it in Rome, live, but that's the way it goes, as we all know. So, here I am. I'm a photographer. I've been a photographer for 36 years now. I decided in 1984, at the tender age of 32, to attempt to make my living with a camera, and I'm still doing it, which isn't a bad run, really. So, I'm known for street photography these days, but I've done a little bit of everything. Because when I became a photographer, that's all I had. I was courageous and very ignorant. I didn't know my craft, and I had to earn a living in a hurry. So I went to the library, I pretty much perused the entire collection and learned a lot, made a lot of mistakes, but eventually built a client base doing portraiture, performing arts, public relations, and big public events. My first big gig was photographing the Kentucky Fried Chicken Bluegrass Festival in 1985, and that opened several doors to me. Because when you photograph events like that, you meet all sorts of people who have other connections, and one thing leads to another, and if you always show up on time and dress properly for the event, they'll usually ask you back, assuming your pictures are good, of course. So that's how I started. And so I went forth and began doing, for bread and butter work, public relations, which is often a lot of company newsletters, it's cocktail parties, it's people standing around with drinks in their hands, men in suits giving each other plaques and cutting ribbons and smiling and shaking hands. Pretty rote, regular stuff. But after a while, I also began to notice the things that weren't so smooth and pretty, and the things that were a little uncomfortable. And I would take those pictures too, but I'd put them aside and not give them to my clients because, well, I wanted to work for them again because they would pay me. But they were not going to pay me if I showed them a bunch of uncomfortable pictures. But those became the beginning of my real journey into street photography, looking for the unusual moments. So my biggest break was when I became the official photographer for the Kentucky Derby Festival in Louisville, Kentucky. Now that's the home of the Kentucky Derby, the biggest horse race in America. And as the official photographer, everyone saw me down front working, and then they saw all these beautiful photographs and they figured, wow, he's good. So when I could go in and call on a company looking for work, please sir, here are my humble photographs, will you hire me? They say, oh Richard, we know you, sure. And that became a calling card. But again, at the same time, there were those odd little moments, and I really began to look for them. And that led to a series of, shall we say, outtakes that I call spectators. And it's what I want to show to you now. early in 1992. I've been a photographer for 8 years. I'm just about 40 years old, at the height of my powers, running film and shooting every day as a working photographer. An opportunity came my way to go to Russia. Now, all my life I'd wanted to go to Russia because in the 50s and 60s in America, when I was growing up, that was the place you really didn't want to go because it was obviously a very bad place because it was that era. So, of course, this made me want to go all the more. So, again, in 1992, the opportunity arose and I grabbed it. So in October of that year, staying with families in their flats in Moscow and St. Petersburg, for the first time in my life, I had a true street photography experience. I was on my feet all day, every day, for 2 weeks solid, with 2 cameras and a whole load of film, no shot list, and no agenda. It was a seminal moment, and I think perhaps the first time that I truly found my voice in what we now call street photography. There's a feel to these pictures that is more traditional and romantic, I guess, because there's no flash, and I was obviously very influenced by my work, or my study, if you will, in the library by first and foremost Kertész and then Cartier-Bresson at that point in my career. And there is that sort of classical feel to these pictures. But it was a magical moment. So I came back from Russia and immediately plunged back into ordinary work because I had to earn a living. The following spring, again, came around the Derby Festival and then the events of the summer, which included the Louisville Strassenfest and the Kentucky State Fair and all the Kentucky Derby Festival chow wagons. Now, these are essentially beer gardens where one goes to, well, drink beer and listen to music and hang out with your friends and check out whoever you're interested in checking out. And to photograph those meant using a flash, which is not something I've generally done. I'm also a little cautious about using a flash in public because you have to be conscious of the fact that when you pop a flash in somebody's face, you're slapping them in the eyeballs, which is an inherently hostile act, and you got to be prepared for that. So it was a little different. So for this, I used a very small camera because I didn't want to go around with my big honking SLR and a big flash, because then people go, look, there's a photographer, get him! Because you only get one shot. Once the flash goes off, they all know you're there. So I ended up using a little baby camera, this little Olympus XA, which has a powerful flash. It's like a baby Leica. You focus it yourself, you set your own apertures, and it works very, very well. And that way, I looked unobtrusive, which was, in this case, a good thing. And over the next few years, produced a body of work called Big Hair and True Love. So things are going along fairly smoothly. I'm earning a living. I can pay my rent and then my mortgage. And I'm about as busy as a one-man photography shop can be. But after 12 years of this, and all the public relations work, and the same men, usually men, occasionally women, but mostly men, giving each other plaques and shaking hands and smiling, I was beginning to feel a little stale and thinking, how can I change this? How can I make this more exciting? Well, little did I know. In the summer of 1996, I met the woman who is now my wife. And before I knew it, I was married and I was getting ready to move to London. And that was a huge change. Being married, being in a different country, going from a small city to one of the world's largest great cities, and not knowing a soul. Being a photographer, what did I do? I walked everywhere with my camera and started to make pictures of, well, anything that interested me, as always. And I spent a lot of time running errands and doing things for our flat and buying groceries while she had to work and things of that sort. And I spent a lot of time on the underground. So what does that mean? I took a lot of pictures in the underground and came up with a whole lot of pictures that really became the first pictures that became well known outside my ordinary milieu, especially after I met David Gibson in 2001, and then Matt Stewart and Nick Turpin and all the original members of the nascent inpublic.com. David had come across my work at an art consultancy and thought, he looks like the kind of guy who should be part of this group. And before long, In Public was growing. It was the first street photography collective on the internet, which was still relatively new. And if you looked for street photography at that time, you wouldn't find anything that was contemporary and up to date. So in joining the group, we created a presence for contemporary street photography on the web, and we're the first. And that's really a pretty great honor to have been part of all of those fine people all these years. Of course, 20 years later, we've rebranded ourselves and we're now UP photographers. People have come and gone, but we're still going and still a collective of really fine photographers. And I'm proud to be a part of it. But anyway, back to my original point. Here are some of those pictures I made in the London Underground. There are a lot of juxtapositions and things that are now considered probably very much cliche, but in 1998, 1999, when I was making these photographs, it wasn't a cliche, it was new, and there just wasn't a lot of it. And I'm still very pleased with this group of pictures. In 2008, circumstances forced us to move to New York. Now, I've spent a lot of time there, I'm perfectly comfortable there and knew the city well enough, but I hadn't actually lived there for any length of time. So at first, I took pictures in black and white, as I had continued to do through most of my career with my personal work. However, I was beginning to feel just a little stale and trying to figure out how can I reinvigorate the work and without using the change of venue as an excuse. So in 2010, I'd heard that the Leica M9 was a really good camera, and having used Leicas most of my career, I went and I got one, and I made a really important decision, which was to work on the streets in color. Now, some people say, yeah, so what, big deal. But color is much more difficult to do well because you have so many more variables to deal with, and there's so much more that can go wrong with a photograph. So, in spite of this, I went forth and continued all my street photography in New York in color. And over the next 8-9 years, that's what I did. And it led to, in 2016, the publication of this book, which some of you have, some of you have seen, published by Peanut Press, David Carroll and Ashley Stoll, and I was very pleased with it. It's interesting that the publication of books, in my case, seemed to sum up eras in many ways of my career. I mean, my first little book, Richard Bram Street Photography, was black and white and published in 2006 and very much summed up my career up to that point with a lot of greatest hits. But anyhow, I continued to shoot and I was very pleased with the work that I got. At the end of that year, word came down that we were moving back to London. I was really happy about that because I'd wanted to do so, and we'd been planning on it for a couple of years. So here I am in our house in London on the Thames in Limehouse, the same neighborhood we lived in before, and this is my home. But we continue to travel. I continue to make pictures. I have spent a lot of time over the years in Mexico, and have just started to work on all the photographs I've made over many, many visits to that country. But of course, I've also spent quite a bit of time in Italy. And since this is the Italian Street Photography Festival, I'm going to close this out by saying grazie mille, buona fortuna, and I wish you all the best in strange times. And here's some pictures from Italy.